Flight attendant accuses a black judge of lying. Then he makes one call, and she's fired on the spot. He boarded the plane like any other passenger, composed and serene, clutching a first-class ticket. However, just moments after settling in, a flight attendant approached him and delivered 5 blunt words. "You don't belong up here." Without a second thought or any inquiries, she ordered him to move to the back of the plane. What she failed to realize was that the man she had just embarrassed, all while wearing a smile, was not merely another traveler. He was a federal judge with the authority to upend her entire life. And with a single phone call, he did just that. Before we dive into the story, let's reflect. Please share where you're tuning in from today. And if you appreciate stories like this, make sure to subscribe and activate the bell icon so you won't miss the next one. He boarded the plane quietly, dressed in a navy blue suit with polished shoes, exuding a calm demeanor that caught the attention of a few passengers, though he appeared oblivious to it. In his right hand, he held a well-worn leather briefcase, while his left grasped a neatly folded boarding pass. His name was Malcolm Hayes, a senior federal judge recognized in the legal community for his keen intellect. With a calm demeanor and an air of quiet strength, Jerome arrived at seat 1A in the first-class cabin. He offered a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door before settling in with effortless grace. He tucked his briefcase beneath the seat, fastened his seatbelt, and retrieved a slender book of poetry from his coat pocket. Ignoring his phone and refraining from engaging with those around him, he sat in serene composure, turning the pages with a deliberate rhythm, embodying patience and tranquility. Meanwhile, not far down the aisle, Sarah Mitchell, the lead flight attendant for the journey, was navigating through the cabin. She maintained her usual sharpness, standing tall with perfect posture and a professional expression tinged with pride. Her uniform was impeccably wrinkle-free, and her eyes scanned the seats as if conducting an inspection. As she entered first class, her gaze moved past the typical business travelers until it landed on Jerome. For a brief moment, her polite demeanor wavered, and she hesitated. Then, regaining her composure, she straightened her shoulders and approached his seat. "Excuse me, sir," Rachel said, her voice carrying enough to catch the attention of several nearby passengers. Nearby passengers turned to look. "Can I see your boarding pass again, please?" Jerome looked up, surprised but unfazed, his voice steady. "Certainly." He handed it to her without hesitation. Rachel held the pass, staring at it and blinking slowly. "This says seat 1A, she said, emphasizing each word as if clarifying something complex. "This is a first-class seat." "Yes, it is," Jerome replied evenly. She glanced at the name again, then at his face and back to the pass. "Are you sure this isn't a mistake? Maybe your company ... Jerome shook his head, indicating there was no mistake. Rachel's voice became firm as she said, "Sir, I must ask you to move to economy. We can resolve this later, but for now, I need this seat cleared." The cabin fell silent, and several passengers turned to observe them. One woman lowered her magazine to watch. Jerome closed his book, slowly returned his boarding pass to his coat pocket, and stood up. He remained silent, offered no argument, and simply picked up his briefcase, walking toward the back with his eyes fixed ahead and his jaw set. Rachel stepped aside, arms crossed. As he walked by, she let out a soft exhale through her nose, as if to calm a disturbance. Jerome made his way to the back rows of the plane and found an empty seat near the rear. He stowed his bag under the seat and sat quietly, composed. He took out his phone, unlocked it, and typed a brief message. "Removed from first class. Boarding pass denied. No explanation." After hitting send, the screen went dark. His expression remained unchanged as he glanced down at his hands for a moment, then turned to look out the small window beside him. What Rachel hadn't realized was that the man she had, the embarrassment she felt was not just from dealing with a regular passenger. He was someone whose single phone call could unravel everything she had built. That call had just been placed. In first class, Sarah Mitchell navigated the cabin with a newfound assurance, serving drinks and warmly greeting other passengers with cheerful smiles. The minor incident with Jerome had already slipped from her thoughts. To her, it was merely a mistake that had been rectified. She took pride in maintaining an orderly and professional atmosphere in the cabin, oblivious to the curious looks from a handful of passengers. Those who had witnessed the event murmured softly, while others averted their gazes, uncertain of what they had just seen, but feeling uneasy nonetheless. At the back of the plane, Malcolm Hayes sat in silence, his long legs slightly cramped in the narrow economy seat. He refrained from complaining or sighing, resting his hands on the armrests with an unreadable expression. Yet beneath that calm facade, his mind was racing. He wasn't angry, but rather disappointed, not only by the humiliation, but by the ease with which it had occurred, how casually Rachel had handled it. Had let him go without a valid reason. His phone buzzed, displaying a message. "Who removed you? What airline?" He quickly replied, typing each word with precision. "Flight 714 Horizon Air Flight Attendant? Sarah Mitchell." There was no response, and he didn't expect one. The person on the other end had all the information they required. A few rows ahead, a young flight attendant named Emma Carter approached the galley to fetch extra water bottles. As she walked by Rachel, she hesitated for a moment and said, "Hey, that man I noticed earlier that his ticket clearly indicated 1A when he boarded." Rachel didn't even glance up. "I know what I saw," she replied icily. "The system must have glitched, or he was mistakenly upgraded." Clara hesitated but chose not to argue. Rachel seemed confident. Turning to face her, Rachel spoke in a low, resolute tone. "Look, Clara, I've been doing this for 15 years. I can tell when someone doesn't belong. Trust me, if he was meant to be up here, he would have said something. Let's not make this a big deal, okay?" Clara nodded slowly and walked away, her expression one of concern. Rachel made her way back to her tray service, beaming and engaging in conversation with fellow first-class passengers. Unbeknownst to her, just a short distance below, in a discreet operations room on the ground, alarm bells were sounding, and amidst the flurry of calls, someone had just demanded, "Get the captain on the line now." In the cockpit, Captain James Larson was conducting routine flight checks when the in-flight phone beside him illuminated. It was an unexpected moment for a ground operations call. He answered, anticipating a standard update, but instead the voice on the other end was terse and to the point. "Captain Ames, this is David Walsh from Horizon Air's Executive Response Team. We've received a report regarding a passenger in first class who was mistakenly removed. His name is Malcolm Hayes." Captain Ames blinked. The name rang a bell. He was a federal judge, a senior bench-known figure. While collaborating closely with the Aviation Oversight Board, he possessed a valid first-class ticket for Seat 1A. However, your lead attendant compelled him to move to economy, providing misleading justifications. The cockpit fell silent, and the co-pilot glanced over in confusion. A chill ran down the captain's spine. "Sir," he said cautiously, "we weren't made aware of any problems in first class." "You are now," Malcolm responded sharply. "We need you to speak with the lead flight attendant immediately to confirm the situation." Judge Collins has already reached out to his office, and legal is involved. We've briefed the CEO, and I've been instructed to tell you to treat this as a crisis. Captain Ames swallowed, understanding the gravity of the situation. He slowly ended the call, replaced the receiver, and turned to the intercom. His voice was calm, though slightly strained. "Lead flight attendant Sarah Mitchell, please report to the cockpit in the galley." Rachel stiffened as the message came through. Attendants typically weren't called to the cockpit mid-air unless there was an emergency. She adjusted her uniform, smoothed her hair, and walked to the front, her heels softly tapping on the carpeted floor. Upon entering the cockpit, the captain turned to her, his expression tense. "Rachel, I just spoke with ground operations. Did you remove a passenger from Seat 1A? Rachel blinked, taken aback by the inquiry. "Yes, a man was seated there. I checked his pass, but he didn't seem—" She paused, unsure how to finish her thought. "I assumed it was an error. He didn't match the typical profile." Captain Ames's gaze sharpened. "You assumed," he said, and Rachel felt her throat tighten. "Rachel," he continued deliberately, "that passenger is Judge Malcolm Hayes. You just removed a sitting federal judge from first class without justification. Legal is now involved, and the executive team is monitoring this flight in real time." Rachel's stomach churned. I didn't know." That's the issue, the captain responded. You should have known. You had his boarding pass. You had access to the manifest. Her voice fell to in a low voice. He asked, "What do you want me to do?" He looked at her for a moment before responding, "You're going to fix it now." Rachel exited the cockpit, her heart racing. The composed demeanor she usually maintained felt like it was falling away. She hurried down the aisle, striving to restore a polite expression, but her palms were clammy and the back of her neck burned. As she approached the economy section, passengers glanced her way, and a few hushed conversations began to circulate. Jerome remained silently seated. With his eyes fixed ahead and arms relaxed on the armrests, his posture remained unchanged. He appeared to be a man at peace, yet there was an underlying tension in his stillness, reminiscent of a storm lurking beneath a serene sky. Rachel crouched beside him, mustering a tight smile. "Sir," she started, her voice low but strained, "there's been a misunderstanding. I would like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Jerome slowly turned his head to face her, his gaze steady and unreadable. He didn't reply right away, causing Rachel's smile to waver. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she added hastily, her tone sounding more practiced than genuine. He regarded her for a moment longer before speaking. "A misunderstanding?" Rachel nodded a bit too eagerly. "Yes, it was an error. It wasn't done on purpose." Jerome raised an eyebrow. "You had my boarding pass, you checked my name, you noted my seat number. What exactly was unclear?" The onlookers were now attentive, some openly turning their heads while others feigned disinterest, yet all were focused on Rachel. She felt a flush creep to her cheeks. She started, but her words faltered. Jerome's voice remained steady and composed. "You didn't question anyone else in first class, just me. Why is that?" Rachel parted her lips but then fell silent. The stillness was more profound than any words she might have uttered. He stood up slowly, picked up his briefcase, and stepped into the aisle. "Let's go," he said softly, but the weight of his tone made Rachel feel increasingly small with each word. The walk back to first class felt like a march through judgment. Passengers looked at her with eyes that were no longer admiring or neutral, but sharp and questioning. Some leaned out of their rows to get a better look. Jerome remained silent as he returned to seat 1A, placing his bag under the seat once more, sitting down and buckling in as if nothing had happened. Rachel lingered beside him for a moment. Uncertain if she should say anything further, she mumbled, "If there's anything you need, please let me know." Jerome didn't even glance her way. He opened his book, turned to the marked page, and resumed reading. Rachel turned and walked away, each step slower than the last, acutely aware of the stares on her back. She had returned him to his seat, but it was evident to everyone on board that this was far from over. Rachel returned to the galley, a mere shadow of the confident person she had been just an hour ago. Her shoulders, once straight and assured, now slightly slumped. The footsteps grew heavier as she occupied herself with cups and trays, feigning an effort to arrange supplies that were already perfectly organized. Had encountered angry passengers, aggressive ones, even those who were abusive. But Jerome had not displayed anger. He had exhibited restraint and dignity, which somehow made her feel even more insignificant. At the front of the plane, Jerome sat quietly in seat 1A, his book resting on his lap, now forgotten. He had stopped reading and was lost in thought about what had transpired, reflecting on how swiftly a single instance of bias could dismantle a person's lifelong pursuit of justice. He had dedicated his life to establishing his reputation, yet all it took was one look from a flight attendant who deemed him out of place. His phone buzzed once more, displaying a brief message. Internal review initiated, CEO looped in, action pending upon landing. He neither smiled nor frowned. He merely read the message and locked the screen again, his hands resting calmly in his lap. This wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about the principal passengers around him adjusted their positions, some deliberately avoiding his eyes while a few regarded him with a subtle acknowledgement. They understood he was not just another traveler. They had all seen the events unfold and had chosen to remain passive. Rachel lingered in the galley, her gaze fixed vacantly on the metal wall ahead. She was unaware that Jerome's call had already escalated to the highest levels. She had no idea that Horizon Air's legal and PR teams were busy drafting responses, She was oblivious to the activity taking place in a corporate office somewhere. In downtown, her employee file had just been retrieved. All she felt was the loss of her authority and control. And the most frightening aspect was that it wasn't merely one error, it was the underlying reason for it. Time dragged on in the cabin, the typical hum of in-flight service replaced by a quieter, more tense environment. Conversations became brief, movements more careful, and even those passengers who hadn't seen the incident sensed that something was amiss. It was an atmosphere where silent glances were exchanged, but words remained unspoken. Everyone sensed that something was amiss, yet no one dared to break the silence in first class. Jerome sat motionless, his demeanor composed, but an air of tension surrounded him. The same passengers who had previously overlooked him now observed him from the periphery of their vision. Some displayed guilt, while others exhibited curiosity, but none could maintain eye contact for long. A middle-aged man across the aisle, clad in a gray blazer and wearing noise-canceling headphones, gradually removed the headphones and leaned in toward Jerome, clearing his throat. I saw what happened, he said. Earlier, he quietly remarked that it was unfortunate. Jerome turned slightly to face him. Unfortunate? He inquired, not unkindly, but clearly noting the word. The man shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I mean, clearly a mistake. Jerome raised an eyebrow. A mistake? He echoed. The man hesitated. Or perhaps a misunderstanding. Jerome remained silent, and the tension in the air thickened with unspoken implications. After a moment, he looked, yet nothing could divert her attention from the mounting pressure in her chest. Earlier, she had felt empowered, in command of her surroundings, but now the silence from the crew and the glances from the passengers made the cabin feel colder and more confined. Clara stood nearby, her hands clasped behind her back, initially silent. She had witnessed everything, the public dismissal, the walk of return, and Rachel's attempt at an apology. The atmosphere was palpable, had shifted. Even the sound of the engines felt more remote now. Finally, Clara broke the silence. You okay? Rachel didn't look up. I'm fine. You don't look fine, I said. I'm fine, Rachel snapped, immediately regretting the sharpness in her tone. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadied her breath, then softened her voice. I just need to get through this flight. Clara observed her for a few seconds before leaning forward slightly. You know who he is, right? Rachel looked up, her eyes weary. I know. He didn't say a word or raise his voice. I didn't insult you. Clara's voice was calm, yet firm. It was the silence that unsettled me. Rachel remained silent, pouring herself a cup of water and taking a deliberate sip, her hand still shaking. She ate away and returned to his seat, signaling that the conversation had reached its end. At the front of the cabin, Rachel stood just behind the curtain, listening intently to everything that transpired. She left the galley to survey the aisles, but her true intention was to sense the atmosphere and assess the extent of the situation. The more she listened, the more anxious she felt. She discreetly took out her phone and opened the internal crew chat app, but there were no messages, no alerts, no updates. The silence only heightened her fear. She recalled Jerome's expression when she instructed him to move. Not angry, not loud, just composed and unwavering. It wasn't a calm born of resignation. It was a different kind entirely. Stemmed from a clear understanding of oneself and one's capabilities, all without uttering a word. In the galley, Clara stood once more, arms crossed, casually leaning against a cabinet. Do you really believe they'll want to talk to you when we land? She inquired, and Rachel glanced up. What do you mean? I mean the management or HR, whoever is responsible for these matters. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temple. I told the captain I made a mistake. Clara tilted her head. Is that really what it was? Rachel remained silent. She understood the gravity of her actions and the reasons behind them. The most troubling part was that she couldn't convince herself it was an accident. She hadn't sought out anyone else's boarding pass in first class, only his, not due to his actions, but because of his appearance. Meanwhile, in seat 1A, Jerome's phone buzzed once more. This time the message was brief. CEO is briefed. Direct action will be taken. Upon landing, brace yourself for a formal apology and a crew review. He exhaled through his nose, maintaining his calm demeanor. He had no desire for drama, only for accountability. He cast a glance toward the curtain where Rachel had vanished moments before. Though the curtain remained still, he could feel her discomfort, her fear, her realization that something had irrevocably changed. Behind her composed facade, Rachel sensed it as well. She had crossed a line, and the repercussions were already poised to greet her at the gate. The hum of the engines continued to hum steadily, yet the atmosphere within the cabin had transformed entirely. It wasn't merely the hushed tones of the crew or the soft conversations among passengers. It was something more profound, a palpable weight in the air, a subtle tension that caused people to adjust their posture, lower their voices, and observe more intently. Captain James Larson occupied the cockpit, poring over flight data, though his focus repeatedly wandered. With over 20 years of flying experience, he had encountered unruly passengers, disruptive incidents, emergencies, and even a handful of scandalous situations. Incidents that captured headlines, yet this one stood apart. It wasn't merely about a passenger being relocated. It revolved around the identity of that passenger and the stark contrast in how someone wielding power was treated as if they had none. The in-flight phone rang once more, and he answered without hesitation. "Captain Ames," came the voice from the operations center. "The CEO has approved a formal crew review upon landing. A private vehicle will be waiting for Judge Collins at the gate, and security will accompany the lead flight attendant for questioning. You are to maintain complete transparency, no internal delays." Acting swiftly, Captain Ames gave a slow nod, signaling his understanding. "I'll ensure the crew is ready," he said before ending the call. He rubbed his jaw, a sinking feeling settling in. He sensed this flight would be one that lingered in people's memories long after it touched down. Meanwhile, Rachel stood in the galley, staring blankly at the drawer of snack trays, untouched for over 10 minutes. She felt Clara's presence behind her, like a shadow that refused to fade. "They just called the cockpit again," Clara said, breaking the silence. "Did he tell you?" Rachel remained still, not turning around. Something was unfolding, a palpable tension in the air. Slowly, she turned to face Clara. "I know," she said softly. Clara paused, then continued. "You should probably start considering what you'll say when we land. This isn't going to just fade away." Rachel tightened her jaw. "It was just one mistake." Clara arched an eyebrow. "Was it, though?" Rachel fell silent. She couldn't deny the truth. Deep down, she recognized it wasn't merely a single error, but rather years of unspoken patterns, unexamined beliefs, and justifications she had convinced herself were innocuous. She had always relied on her instincts, but today they had guided her directly into chaos, leaving her ensnared in the consequences from seat one. Jerome checked his phone once more. Another message had come through, this time from a recognizable name, someone associated with the Board of Judicial Conduct. It was a brief note of encouragement, recognizing the incident and notifying him that a formal communication had already been dispatched to the airline's board of directors. He hadn't requested that, but that was the nature of quiet respect. It acted independently, flowing effortlessly. In the aisle, more passengers started to sense that something was amiss. A woman leaned toward the man next to her and murmured, "I think that's the guy from earlier, the one they moved to the back. He's back in first class now." "Yes, and something's definitely off. The flight attendants are behaving oddly." Whispers like that quickly spread through the cabin. Meanwhile, in the galley, Rachel clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. She had dedicated years to building her reputation, known for her sharp instincts. She was efficient and straightforward. Never one to tolerate chaos, she maintained strict control. However, this time her firm grip had overlooked the reality, and now it was on a collision course with disaster. Abruptly, she turned to Clara and stated, "I need a moment," her tone devoid of warmth. Without waiting for a response, she pushed through the curtain and headed toward the restroom, her strides quick and rigid. A few passengers glanced up as she moved down the aisle, but she kept her gaze downcast. For the first time in her career, she wished to remain unnoticed. Once inside, she locked the restroom door. She stood behind the sink, gazing at her reflection. The harsh fluorescent lights aged her appearance. Her eyes were rimmed in red, and her lips were tightly pressed together. She splashed cold water on her face and grasped the counter for support. Her heart raced, not from guilt or the fear of job loss, but from a deeper dread, the understanding that the harm was irreversible and exposed. There was no way to rectify this in the moment, no chance to mitigate it with a report or a gentle apology. Someone had witnessed her make a decision without justification. A man found himself in a place he had paid to occupy, yet he felt out of place. This man possessed every resource, every voice, every platform available to him, yet he opted for restraint, choosing not to shout, not to rage, not to threaten. Instead, he decided to wait, and that silence was poised to resonate more powerfully than anything Rachel had ever encountered. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a gentle ding, indicating the start of the descent. Captain Ames's voice came through the intercom with the familiar landing announcement. Calm and rehearsed, but for many in the cabin, it barely registered. Eyes shifted, conversations ceased, and the atmosphere thickened into something almost tangible. Rachel emerged from the restroom, her hair slightly disheveled and her eyes heavy with fatigue. She bypassed the mirror, having seen enough already. As she made her way back to the galley, her gaze roamed over the cabin. She sensed the stares, subtle yet unmistakable. Some passengers glanced up only to quickly avert their eyes, while others held their gaze a moment longer, not with disdain but with recognition. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer in the background. Clara stood at the entrance of the galley, motionless and silent, observing Rachel as she hurried by. Rachel rushed past the curtain, snatching a stack of landing cards, her hands trembling slightly. Uncertain whether to maintain the routine, part of her wished to act as if everything was normal, but deep down she understood that it was far from it. In seat 1A, Jerome fastened his seatbelt with careful precision, folding the poetry book that had rested in his lap and tucking it into the side pocket of his seat. With his briefcase beside him, he leaned back, maintaining a composed demeanor. His phone buzzed one final time, delivering a brief message. "Security is at the gate. You'll be escorted first." A media inquiry had already been sent to the airline. He set the phone face down on the tray table, unwilling to check for further updates. Not yet. Not until the wheels touched down. As the aircraft began its descent, the cabin tilted slightly and the lights dimmed, casting elongated shadows across the passengers' faces. Some stared straight ahead, feigning indifference, while others stole curious glances. As they approached Jerome, he remained silent since returning to first class. Yet that silence spoke volumes. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer leaned slightly to his left, attempting to regain Jerome's attention. But he hesitated. There was nothing left to say, having already said too little when it counted. Rachel stood motionless by the service area, her gaze fixed on the safety placards, her mind racing. She was uncertain about what would unfold upon landing, having never encountered a situation like this before. Has always been the one drafting incident reports, never the focus of them. "Rachel," Clara said gently from behind her, "you should sit down. We're about to land." Rachel turned, taken aback by the softness in Clara's tone, but it didn't ease her discomfort. It only heightened her sense of vulnerability. "I'll wait," Rachel murmured. "Just a few more minutes." In the cockpit, Captain Ames concentrated on the controls, his voice steady as he communicated with air traffic control, though his mind was elsewhere. He had seen the report sent from the operations team. He had seen the subject line: high alert, public relations risk, executive oversight required. He understood the implications. A statement would be released within hours, and journalists might already be catching wind of it. By morning, Malcolm Hayes would likely be trending. The runway came into view, obscured by wispy clouds as the descent remained smooth and steady. When the wheels made contact with the ground, a low rumble echoed through the cabin, but it lacked the usual sense of relief that accompanied arrival. Instead, it felt weightier. Jerome straightened his jacket and he looked out the window, his expression unchanged, yet the gravity of recent events and the uncertainty ahead weighed heavily in his chest. He had remained silent, observing as those around him feigned ignorance. He had been affected without reason, overlooked without consideration, and it was only after a solitary message that anyone bothered to inquire about what had transpired. Now, as the door at the front of the plane was about to open, Rachel stood motionless, the brakes hissing as the aircraft came to a gentle stop. Her throat felt parched and her hands were icy. For the first time in her career, uncertainty gripped her as the flight concluded and her reckoning commenced. The aircraft glided to a gentle halt at the gate, the hiss of hydraulics accompanying the engine's final winding down. A soft ding resonated overhead, marking the flight's end, yet no one unbuckled or rose from their seats. It felt as though every passenger sensed that this was not merely another routine landing. Rachel remained still in the galley, her gaze locked on the front door of the plane, which still hadn't opened. She could no longer hear the murmur of passengers, nor the sound of Clara moving trays or folding blankets. All that filled her ears was the pounding of her own pulse, a rhythm that quickened her breath as the intercom buzzed to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Ames announced, his voice steady, yet more resolute than usual, "please remain seated. We will begin deplaning shortly. Thank you for flying with us." The ensuing silence was palpable. Rachel turned her gaze toward the cockpit, anticipating a signal, but none was given. Then the door swung open with a click was followed by a slow, pressurized hiss as bright white light from the jet bridge flooded the entryway. The first figure to board was a man in a black suit, devoid of any airline logo or name tag, yet possessing sharp eyes and a serious expression. He was accompanied by a second man sporting a security badge clipped to his belt and an earpiece resting against his neck. Behind them, a third individual stood, holding a tablet and wearing a lanyard with a prominent silver badge that read, "Internal Affairs, Horizon Air." Rachel felt a knot in her stomach as the man in the suit acknowledged the captain before turning to Clara. "We're here for two matters," he stated softly yet distinctly. "First, we'll escort Mr. Collins, and then we'll talk to your lead." Clara's expression went blank. She nodded slowly and stepped aside. The security officer moved steadily down the aisle towards seat 1A, and the passengers watched openly, no longer pretending to be uninvolved. Some leaned into the aisle, while others murmured quietly, their eyes fixed on him. Malcolm Hayes remained seated, having already gathered his belongings. With his briefcase closed and jacket buttoned, he required no instructions. He noticed the officer approaching and stood still. The security officer gave a respectful nod, saying, "Sir, we're ready when you are." Jerome took a moment to glance around the cabin at the passengers who had previously looked away, the ones who had whispered, and those who remained silent. He then gave a slow nod and walked down the aisle, briefcase in hand, posture straight and expression composed. No one uttered a word as he passed. A few slightly bowed their heads. One woman murmured, "He handled that with class," as he reached the end. As the door opened, Rachel instinctively stepped forward, her lips parting as if to speak, but Jerome didn't acknowledge her. He exited the plane without uttering a word, his silence resonating more than any speech. The suited man turned to Clara and said, "Now we'd like to speak with Ms. Sarah Mitchell." Rachel felt her entire body tense. Her feet felt rooted to the ground. Clara remained silent, merely looking at Rachel before stepping aside. The internal affairs officer raised his tablet and addressed her. "Miss Benton, please bring your identification and crew pass. Escorted to the operations room, we will conduct a preliminary review prior to the full debriefing." Rachel nodded stiffly, each step feeling as if it were made of stone as she approached them. As she moved through the curtain into the main cabin, the atmosphere felt altered. The authority she once possessed, the presence that had demanded attention, had vanished. Passengers regarded her now not with curiosity, but with a silent judgment. When she reached seat 1A, now vacant, she paused momentarily, her gaze drawn to the headrest, which still bore the imprint of the man she attempted to distance herself, averting her gaze as she continued walking. At the gate, Jerome encountered two senior executives from Horizon Air. One of them extended his hand, saying, "Mr. Collins, I want to convey our sincerest apologies on behalf of the entire company." Jerome hesitated for a moment, then shook the man's hand, feeling a firm and steady grip. The executive continued, "A thorough investigation will be conducted. Immediate actions are being implemented. This matter will not be overlooked." Jerome hesitated before responding, finally stating, "This isn't about me." The executive quickly nodded in acknowledgement. "We understand." Jerome shifted his gaze toward the window, where the plane remained at the gate, its nose directed at the terminal, oblivious to the impending storm surrounding it. Meanwhile, as Rachel exited the aircraft under escort, the terminal erupted with the flash of cameras and a cacophony of voices. "Is it true you removed a federal judge from his position? Do you have any comments regarding the discrimination allegations? Did you know who he was?" She recoiled at the inquiry, but remained silent, quickening her pace toward the corridor. By morning, her name would be splashed across every article. She was already aware of that. What terrified her most wasn't merely the prospect of losing her job, but the realization that the entire world would now witness what she had endeavored to conceal behind policies, authority, and her uniform. In a single swift judgment, she had revealed her true self. The terminal hummed with the familiar sounds of the airport, wheels gliding over polished floors, and flight announcements resonating from above. Children were pulling at their parents while travelers hurried to their gates, but just outside Gate 6B, an unusual scene was taking shape. A crowd of onlookers had formed near the windows, whispering softly, their eyes glued to the jet bridge. Phones were held aloft, and security personnel were strategically placed, exuding a quiet authority. The typical stream of passengers had dwindled to a curious few. Malcolm Hayes stood just beyond the arrival gate, encircled by a small group of airline executives and legal representatives. Though several attempted to, he replied with little more than nods or short acknowledgments. He had no interest in apologies given under duress. He had experienced enough of them and heard enough to know that what truly mattered now was not who expressed regret, but rather what actions the airline would take next when the spotlight was off. One of the executives, a tall woman in a sharp blazer clutching a quivering clipboard, interjected, "Judge Collins, we have already initiated formal internal proceedings. Ms. Benton is currently being questioned by Internal Affairs, and we will inform your office as soon as the review is complete." "Is complete." Jerome gave a subtle nod, his gaze shifting to the side. Through the glass, he observed the aircraft still docked, passengers starting to disembark and moving quietly past the door. Their eyes scanned the terminal for taxis and luggage signs, but now and then, they glanced in his direction. Some offered a slight nod of acknowledgement, while others turned away. Behind him, a press officer leaned in and murmured, "Sir, we would like to issue a public statement with your approval. We can include a quote from you." Jerome averted his gaze, saying, "Not yet." The officer paused, then retreated. Meanwhile, in a secluded conference room tucked away in the airport's back corridors, Sarah Mitchell sat alone at a long table, her hands tightly clasped together, her crew badge positioned neatly in front of her, like a confession. The room was sterile, with white walls and harsh lighting, devoid of windows. A screen on the wall displayed the airline's logo, soft and corporate. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to resonate louder than it should have. She had been waiting for 17 minutes without anyone arriving. As she spoke, her palms were clammy, and she had already wiped them on her skirt twice. Across from her sat two airline investigators, one from Human Resources and the other from Legal Compliance. The man from Legal, a serious figure named Robert Klein, finally lifted a tablet and pressed a button, causing a recording light to flicker on. "Ms. Benton, this is a formal inquiry into the events that transpired aboard Flight 714 concerning your removal of a first-class passenger, Mr. Malcolm Hayes. Do you acknowledge that this incident occurred?" Rachel swallowed hard, her voice faltering. "Scratchy, yes. Did you check Mr. Collins's boarding pass before asking him to vacate his seat?" "I did. I examined it, but she hesitated. I doubted its authenticity. It didn't align with my expectations." Glenn remained unfazed. "What expectations?" Rachel stumbled, her throat constricting. "He simply didn't appear to be a first-class passenger." "You mean by his appearance?" Silence. Glenn leaned in. "Let's be clear, Miss Benton. You removed a federal judge from his assigned first-class seat, despite having a valid ticket in your possession. You did this without adhering to protocol, without consulting the gate agent, neglecting manifest verification, and bypassing crew escalation. You executed this in a way that was publicly humiliating, witnessed by more than 30 passengers in your cabin. I didn't know who he was, she said quickly. That's not the issue, Glenn replied coldly. The issue is that you assumed who he wasn't. Rachel's eyes brimmed with tears, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of them. She felt the urge to argue, to explain that everything had unfolded too quickly, that her decision had been made in haste, and that she believed she was performing her duties, yet the words failed her. She found herself defenseless. The HR officer, a woman with calm eyes and a notebook brimming with notes, glanced up. Miss Benton, this isn't merely a policy breach, it's a question of public trust and reputation. While the judge hasn't initiated a lawsuit yet, a formal discrimination complaint has already been submitted to our board. This incident is under review for termination. Rachel shut her eyes, reflecting on a decade of flawless flights, timely reports, and commendable leadership evaluations. The management of the crew was summarized in a few quiet lines on an investigation form, all of it unraveled by a single choice she could never reverse. Will I be allowed to speak to him? She inquired abruptly. Glenn shook his head. That decision was beyond their control. In the terminal lounge, Jerome occupied a more secluded waiting area, a glass of water and his phone at his side. He had opted out of media interviews for the time being, while the PR team worked on prepared statements. An airline personal assistant offered him a ride home or to a hotel of his preference, but he declined both. He sought no preferential treatment, rather he desired acknowledgement from those who had observed yet remained silent, from the crew who chose to say nothing, and particularly from the woman who felt her uniform entitled her to determine who was worthy of first class. Jerome's phone buzzed once more, this time with a message from his assistant at the courthouse. A public statement from Horizon Air is anticipated in 2 hours, an internal affairs review is in progress, and the media has caught wind of it. Your comment has been requested. He gazed at the message for an extended period. He typed back, inform them that this isn't about me, it's about the consequences of confusing bias with authority. After hitting send, he set the phone face down once more. Outside, passengers flowed by as they always did, hurrying to connections, grabbing coffee, dragging luggage with weary arms. The world didn't pause for injustice. It never did. Yet today it had taken notice. Sarah Mitchell was no longer merely a name on a crew list. Inside the hushed administrative corridor of the airport, Rachel sat slumped in her chair. Gazing at her crew badge as if it had lost its significance, her once immaculate uniform now resembled a costume, a facade for a role she felt she no longer warranted. The internal affairs team had briefly exited to collect more documentation, yet the stillness in the room was more deafening than any interrogation. Her mind raced, fragmented and repetitive. Why did I do that? Why didn't I double-check? Why him? Why just him? She had once viewed this job as her very essence. Her reputation had been impeccable, or so she had thought, having received a promotion. Quicker than most, frequently commended for her effectiveness and composure. Yet none of that held significance now, as the one aspect she was never meant to forfeit, her judgment, had let her down. Across the airport, Jerome occupied a seat in the executive lounge, untouched refreshments nearby. His briefcase lay at his feet, and the screen of his phone remained dark on the table. He was alone by choice. His assistant had offered to remain, but he had requested solitude, a moment of stillness, a chance to breathe. He wasn't angry. Anger was. It was a reactive and temporary feeling that seldom resolved anything. What he felt now was a quieter burden, something heavier than anger. He had encountered bias before, plenty of times, but this instance struck deeper. It wasn't about being removed from his seat, the stares, or the whispers. It was that Rachel had looked at him and made a judgment not grounded in evidence or rules, but rather on her perception. He hadn't been regarded as a man with a first-class ticket. He had been treated like someone who didn't belong, and that hurt more than anything. The significance of this moment was underscored by the gentle vibration of his phone on the table. He looked down to see an incoming call from Eleanor Brooks. He answered, and the voice on the line was steady and direct. Jerome, it said, I've been briefed. It's already making the rounds. Jerome nodded, anticipating the news. I've received calls from 3 networks already asking for a statement. I've told them we won't speak until we see Horizon's official response. Jerome exhaled through his nose, acknowledging the situation. After a brief pause, the Chief Justice continued, "You handled this with restraint. Most individuals would have caused a commotion, but Jerome offered a faint smile. What would that have accomplished?" he asked. "It would have given them a reason to dismiss you," came the response. "Instead, you chose silence, and they filled that void with fear." Jerome nodded, even though the chief couldn't see him. "Let me know if anything changes." "We will." And Jerome, this may begin with one airline, but it's more significant than that. This is about dignity, something people often forget until reminded. The call ended and Jerome lingered for a moment before slowly rising to gather his belongings. He didn't wait for anyone to guide him on what to do next. He had experienced enough situations to recognize when a story was at a pivotal moment. In the internal review room, Rachel's attention was drawn to the door as Robert Klein re-entered. He carried a printed folder in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. "Miss Benton," he said, settling into his seat across from her, "following a review of your conduct and under direct orders from senior management, your role as lead flight attendant is hereby suspended effective immediately." Immediately. Rachel's hands clenched into fists, her nails pressing into her palms. "You will be required to attend a formal disciplinary hearing within 5 business days," Glenn continued. "Until then, you are not to engage in any work duties, enter airline premises, or contact passengers from Flight 714. She remained silent, offering no argument and displaying no surprise. Glenn slid the sealed envelope across the table. "These are your terms of suspension. You may read them later." "Do I still get to speak to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Glenn paused, stating, "That's not our decision to make. He hasn't asked for any contact." Rachel nodded, blinking rapidly to hold back tears. "He didn't scream," she murmured. Glenn leaned in a bit closer. "No, he didn't. He didn't even contest my words." "Exactly," Glenn reiterated. "And that's what will resonate with everyone, because silence from someone like him carries more weight than anything else." Rachel experienced an internal fracture, a sorrow she had previously suppressed, not guilt over the consequences, but a deep awareness that he had borne the weight of her error with such dignity, while she had given him nothing but her misguided assumptions in return. Later that afternoon, Horizon Air issued an official statement. "We acknowledge an incident involving a prominent passenger who faced inappropriate treatment by a senior crew member on Flight 714. We are undertaking a comprehensive investigation." The airline's investigation emphasizes that it does not condone discriminatory behavior under any circumstances. However, the public reaction had already started to shape its own narrative across social media, with videos and posts surfacing from passengers who witnessed the incident. He remained silent, simply grabbed his bag, and moved to the back. The entire cabin felt the tension. We all observed in silence, and that's what lingers in my mind. She locked eyes with him and thought, "I've encountered that far too often." As the airline attempted to navigate the turmoil, one name emerged subtly yet significantly: Malcolm Hayes. His impact stemmed not from loud protests, but from his quiet demeanor, which revealed truths that outrage could not. 3 days had elapsed since Flight 714 touched down, and the reverberations of the in-flight events had only intensified. The footage that captured the incident did not originate from Jerome. Rather, it was recorded by a college student in business class who discreetly documented the exchange. Rachel and Jerome, as it unfolded, she had no intention of creating a viral moment. She merely felt that something was amiss. The video lasted just 48 seconds, capturing Rachel's insistence that the seat be vacated, Jerome's quiet compliance as he stood, and his silent walk down the aisle toward the back of the plane. There were no raised voices, no altercations, just a profound silence. Yet that silence, documented through the grainy lens of a phone camera, garnered over 4 million views in under 2 days, attracting the attention of news outlets. The headlines may have differed in phrasing, but they shared a consistent tone. A federal judge was removed from first class despite holding a valid ticket, raising concerns about discrimination in the skies. The airline faced significant backlash over Flight 714, which ignited a media firestorm. Talk shows engaged in heated debates. Commentators analyzed the situation. Aviation experts discussed protocol breaches, and legal analysts highlighted the broader systemic issues at play. However, for Malcolm Hayes, the chaos outside held little significance. He had refrained from interviews, made no public comments, and had attended two events. In private meetings, one with Horizon's legal team and another with their board of ethics, he communicated clearly and succinctly, devoid of anger or vengeance, focusing solely on the facts. When questioned about the possibility of a lawsuit, he replied, "That depends on what you do when the cameras are gone." Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell returned home, suspended and silent, overshadowed by those who once lauded her professionalism. She resided alone in a modest apartment just 2 blocks from the airport, adorned with framed certificates and years of recognition, along with letters from colleagues expressing their gratitude. Mentorship, yet those frames now gazed back at her, serving as reminders of someone she questioned if she still was. Since returning from the hearing, she hadn't stepped outside the apartment. The airline had offered her a counselor, which she turned down. They sent a packet of PR guidelines in case she decided to speak, but she never opened it. What tormented her the most wasn't the punishment. It was the realization that she finally viewed the moment from the outside. How she approached him, the tone she adopted, and how her posture shifted from professionalism to suspicion in an instant. Because she recalled the subtle tightening of her lips when he presented her with his ticket, the tone she adopted was louder than necessary, public and regrettable. She remembered feeling a sense of confidence in that moment. It wasn't merely a poor decision, but a revelation of who she had permitted herself to become, and now there was no escaping it. On the fourth evening, a simple envelope appeared at her door, lacking a return address. Inside was a solitary printed email directed to her, forwarded through the airline, from Malcolm Hayes, subject, "Accountability, Ms. Benton. I don't express this to offer forgiveness. That's not my intention. I share this because silence can serve as either a shield or a reflection. You interpreted my silence as compliance, but in truth, it signified restraint. I am not seeking a performance from you, nor do I require a public apology. However, I sincerely hope that, for your own benefit, not mine, you take this opportunity to reflect on what you truly perceived when you looked at me and why that was sufficient for you to behave as you did. That insight is not meant for a report. It is meant for you. Between you and your conscience, J. Collins." Rachel read the message 3 times, each time slower than the last. She folded it and set it on her kitchen counter. She didn't cry, didn't tear it up, and didn't text anyone about it. Instead, she sat down and, for the first time since that flight, ceased her attempts to justify herself, even to her own mind. Meanwhile, at a serene courthouse 2 states away, Jerome returned to his chambers. The clerks acknowledged him with quiet nods, and the court officers stood a bit taller as he walked by. Respect had always existed, but now it felt transformed in his office. A pile of letters awaited him, some from law schools, others from public interest groups, a few from strangers, and most handwritten. They all conveyed a similar sentiment, gratitude for how he managed the situation. Jerome didn't reply to most, but he read each one. He understood this wasn't about becoming a symbol. He hadn't intended to teach anyone a lesson. He simply wanted to take his seat quietly like any other passenger. However, when that choice was taken from him, he opted to respond not with noise but with calmness, confidence that the truth would speak for itself, and it did not through his shouting, but rather because he felt no need to raise his voice. In a world accustomed to loud injustices, it was the silence that resonated the most. A week later, the airline industry continued its course. New flights departed, delayed schedules frustrated travelers, and weather alerts flashed on screens in departure lounges. For the typical traveler, Flight 714 was merely a fleeting headline, just another moment of social media uproar in an ongoing cycle of viral indignation. Yet within the walls of Horizon's executive headquarters, the narrative was far from concluded. In a towering glass structure that commanded a view of the city skyline, the boardroom was populated with senior executives, legal counsel, public relations officers, HR directors, and operational leaders gathered around a sleek oak table. At the far end, Michael Sterling, CEO of Horizon Air, sat with his hands clasped in a serious expression. Before him lay a substantial binder labeled Flight 714 Full Incident Review. The atmosphere was charged with tension as he tapped the table twice. "Let's begin," he said. Lisa Bennett, the head of HR, initiated the discussion with the internal report. Sarah Mitchell has been officially suspended due to her conduct, which breached crew protocol and anti-discrimination policies. Her choice to remove Judge Collins was made without proper authorization, verification, or justifiable concern. She has since acknowledged that her instincts, which influenced her decision, were affected by bias. "Is she terminated?" Drexler inquired bluntly. "She submitted a letter of resignation this morning." Naomi responded, "It's effective immediately." Drexler nodded slowly, and the head of PR, Jennifer Holt, added, "We've issued 2 statements, one a formal apology and the other a follow-up detailing our corrective actions. We've received over 12,000 emails from customers, some calling for boycotts while others commend our accountability." The hashtag number Judge714 continues to trend, primarily with positive sentiments regarding Judge Collins' handling of the situation. She paused to sift through her notes, noting that we've also experienced a 9% decline in ticket sales for routes. In the Northeast region, our rivals are leveraging this against us in their advertising campaigns. Drexler's jaw tightened as the judge he approached declined to give interviews. Monica noted that he had provided a written statement to the New York Ledger the previous day, which she read aloud. "I did not seek to be the focus of this narrative. My aim was never to inflict punishment, but to reveal a shared, quiet failure. Our collective failure to scrutinize our assumptions before taking action. I hope this serves not just as a lesson for one airline, but as a standard for every gate, every cabin, and every uniformed employee. Holds the authority to include or exclude." The room fell silent for a few moments before Drexler finally rose. "I want every crew member in this company retrained. Every single one, from top to bottom. This training should encompass not just protocol but also perception. I refuse to allow any employee to make decisions based on someone's appearance ever again." Heads nodded and some took notes. No one voiced dissent. He scanned the room. "We were fortunate that man opted for dignity instead of destruction. We may not be so lucky next time." The meeting was adjourned. That same afternoon, in a modest high school auditorium, Malcolm Hayes stepped onto the stage, not as a judge or a prominent figure, but as a speaker for a youth leadership event. The audience comprised high school students, local teachers, and parents. His focus wasn't on airline policies. Instead, he aimed to discuss the concept of restraint. "I was taught," he began, his voice steady yet soft, "that power is not demonstrated by how loudly you speak, but by what you choose to withhold." He paused, allowing his words to resonate in the stillness of the room. "Sometimes silence serves as a shield. Sometimes it serves as a reflection, often the sole instrument available to reveal to someone the burden of their actions." He gazed across the audience, observing youthful faces, some bewildered, others grasping the gravity of the situation. "For nearly 20 years, I have occupied a bench in a courtroom, absorbing countless narratives from those attempting to justify a moment they cannot undo. And do you know what is frequently absent from their accounts? A pause followed by accountability. That term resonated more profoundly than any gavel he had ever struck. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment, not far from the city, Sarah Mitchell discovered those words in a newspaper left at her doorstep. By habit, she hadn't opened it, as she didn't anticipate seeing her name there. She read every line of Jerome's speech intently, then folded the page and set it beside the envelope that remained untouched on her kitchen counter, the one containing her official resignation confirmation. No one had reached out to her, no media, no colleagues, no supervisors. She was alone now, and perhaps that was the intention, for it was the first time in years that she was compelled to confront this solitude. She sat with a version of herself that had remained unchallenged and unquestioned until one man subtly drew the world's attention to her. Yet he never raised his voice. She revisited his words and softly repeated them. "Power is not demonstrated by the volume of your speech, but by the things you choose to withhold." He paused, allowing the words to resonate in the stillness of the room. Sometimes silence serves as a shield. At other times, it acts as a mirror. And occasionally it becomes the sole instrument left to reveal the burden of one's actions. He gazed out at the audience, young and attentive. Faces, eyes wide, some confused, some understanding. I've spent nearly 2 decades sitting on a bench in a courtroom, listening to countless voices attempting to justify a moment they cannot reclaim. And do you know what is almost always absent from their narratives? A pause followed by accountability. That word resonated more profoundly than any gavel he had ever struck. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment not far from the city, Sarah Mitchell read those words in a newspaper left outside her door. By habit, she hadn't opened it. She never expected to see her name there. She absorbed every word of Jerome's speech without a hint of hesitation, then carefully folded the page and set it next to the envelope that remained unopened on her kitchen counter. The one containing her official resignation confirmation. No one had reached out to her. No media, no colleagues, no supervisors. She found herself in solitude, and perhaps that was the intention, as for the first time in years, she was compelled to confront the version of herself that had gone unchallenged and unquestioned until one man subtly drew the world's attention to her. And yet he never raised his voice. She revisited his words and softly repeated, "Power is not shown in how loud you speak, but in what you choose not to say." For the first time in days, she rose, approached her desk, and opened her laptop, not to defend or explain herself, but to start writing the apology that no one had asked for, yet one she finally recognized she needed to offer. Not for the headlines, not for her job, but for the man who never raised his voice because he didn't have to. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the incident on Flight 714, and while public interest had slowly moved on to other narratives in various parts of the world, legal offices, airline union meetings, civil rights forums, the story was far from concluded. It had ignited not just outrage, but also dialogue, examination, and, most importantly, introspection. At a small community college on the east side of the city, Malcolm Hayes was invited as a guest speaker by a sociology professor. The topic was not air travel or discrimination laws, but rather perception versus truth. The room was filled with students who had followed his story through headlines and hashtags, yet they had never heard from him directly. He didn't rely on notes, as he never did. "I want to discuss power," he began, resting his hands on the podium. "Not the power that comes from a position, but the power that arises from our responses when someone attempts to undermine our dignity." The room fell silent as he scanned the audience, making eye contact with several students. I was instructed to vacate a seat I had paid for without explanation or justification. Just a decision made about me. What they believed they witnessed, he paused. I could have confronted, shouted, insisted. But I've come to understand that raising my voice in spaces that weren't designed to listen often doesn't create opportunities. At times, it merely provides further reasons to shut them. He moved back from the podium a bit, so instead I chose to wait. I made a single call, not out of a desire for vengeance, but out of a need for accountability. He paused once more, and now the world is grappling with a question it should have posed long ago. How many others lack that phone number, that influence, that platform? Countless individuals were displaced from their rightful places, and it went unnoticed. The audience shifted. A girl in the front row nodded, clearly affected, while a young man in the back wiped his tears and glanced down at his notebook. Jerome pressed on, his tone steady yet intense. "What happened to me isn't the worst thing I've faced, not by a long shot, but the significance lies in the fact that it occurred in public, under the gaze of others, and they remain silent. Not out of malice, but because they've been conditioned to keep quiet, to avoid stirring the pot." It was difficult to ignore the situation as he leaned in slightly. A soft murmur of agreement spread among the audience. Meanwhile, in a therapy office across town, Sarah Mitchell sat on a couch, her eyes swollen and her fingers nervously twisting a tissue in her lap. The therapist, calm and attentive, had remained mostly silent. Rachel had come of her own accord, uncertain about what she wanted to express. "I used to believe I was fair," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I treated everyone equally, but that's not the case. Fairness isn't merely a matter of belief. It's reflected in our actions when we think no one is observing. She lowered her gaze, her voice quivering. I glanced at him and made a split-second decision, not because he had done anything wrong, but because something within me instinctively doubted someone like him in that environment. She swallowed hard and I reinforced my choice. I made him walk to the back of the plane in front of everyone, feeling justified in my actions. The therapist allowed her a moment to gather herself. Rachel continued. I hadn't realized what I had finished until he glanced at me. He said nothing, and his expression wasn't one of anger, but rather disappointment, as if I were less than he had expected. Her shoulders drooped. He didn't humiliate me, nor did he retaliate, which only intensified the situation because he had offered me countless opportunities to back down, and I chose not to. After a lengthy silence, she murmured, "And now I can't take it back." The therapist finally spoke. "You can't undo the past, but you can change how you carry it forward." Rachel looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "What if I don't deserve to move forward?" The therapist replied simply, "Then earn it." Later that evening, Rachel opened her laptop again, not to draft an apology for corporate approval or for PR damage control, but for something honest, something real. She began typing to Judge Collins. "You don't owe me a response. You don't owe me anything at all, but I owe you the truth. I saw you take your seat and made a judgment is something I can never rationalize. It wasn't about rules or procedures. It stemmed from my own bias. I took one glance and decided you didn't belong. I humiliated you with confidence, and I did it in front of others. Yet you remained silent. You didn't insult me or attempt to belittle me. You simply made one call and allowed the truth to unfold. That silence revealed more about me than any outburst could. You urged me to reflect on my actions, and I've been doing just that. I'm still searching for answers, and I don't have a complete one yet. I realize now that I was mistaken, and I am committed to spending the rest of my life not only regretting it, but also transforming because of it." Sarah Mitchell hovered over the send button, her heart racing, uncertain if she deserved to be heard. Yet with shaking hands, she finally clicked it. In that brief silent moment, without a uniform, without authority, without power, she did something she hadn't done in years. She spoke the truth. Meanwhile, in a part of the city far from cameras and headlines, Malcolm Hayes received the message. He absorbed every word, then closed his laptop, finally exhaling after 2 weeks. The morning sun gently streamed through the tall windows of Malcolm Hayes' study, and the air was filled only with the soft hum of a ceiling fan and the distant chirping of birds outside. He settled into his armchair, a fresh cup of coffee beside him, and his laptop resting in his lap. The email from Sarah Mitchell remained on the screen, unanswered and untouched since the previous night. He had read it 3 times already. It wasn't just the words that lingered. It was the depth of her words, the honesty, the lack of justifications from a woman who had previously overshadowed him, disregarded him, and left with confidence. This email didn't come across as a show. It felt like a revelation. He was uncertain if she truly meant every word. People often said the right things after facing the fallout, but this seemed different. It didn't feel like she was attempting to salvage her career or reputation. It felt as though she was striving to reconstruct her self-worth from the very foundation. Jerome reclined in his chair, interlacing his fingers. He wasn't an A-man who held on to grudges throughout his life, had shown him just how burdensome they could be. He discovered that life would present countless opportunities to feel wronged, betrayed, or diminished by someone's superficial perception of him. However, he also realized that the real measure of a man wasn't found in how he acted when he was respected, but rather in the decisions he made when he wasn't. That choice had accompanied him on Flight 714, causing the world to pause and take notice. And now that same choice had transformed an apology into something much greater. More than he anticipated, across the city, Rachel sat on a park bench, her first time outdoors in over a week. She wore no makeup, no uniform, no facade of control or confidence. Just jeans, a coat, and a face that seemed a bit older than it had 2 weeks prior. The world hadn't crumbled, but hers had, and perhaps it was time for that. She observed people passing by, fathers with strollers, students on bikes, elderly couples arm in arm. She pondered how many times she had brushed past someone like Jerome before, in grocery stores, hotel lobbies, boarding gates, without giving it a second thought. Or perhaps worse, she contemplated something she had never questioned. A child on the swing nearby laughed, and for a fleeting moment, Rachel smiled. Not because she felt uplifted, but because life had continued. The world moved on and she had a chance, however small, to face it with renewed perspective. Back in Jerome's study, he finally clicked reply. He didn't write much. There was no need. Ms. Benton, I accept your apology, not because I require it, but because you do. I hope you never forget this, and I hope you always commit to the difficult journey of self-improvement. That is the only apology that truly matters. It matters. He hit send, and just like that, the final chapter of the story commenced. Not the type that makes headlines or is splashed across comment sections or media panels, but the subtle kind. The kind that resides in transformed hearts, in humbled egos, in fresh conversations sparked by one man's choice to remain silent and one woman's decision to truly listen. Days morphed into weeks, and the public moved on, forgetting the story as new scandals took the spotlight and new faces dominated the news cycle. Yet the impact endured. Horizon Air initiated a nationwide training program. A comprehensive transformation took place, extending beyond customer service to include training on racial bias awareness and conduct. They established a reporting channel for passengers to report any discriminatory experiences, which is directly accessible to their ethics committee. Other airlines adopted similar measures, not out of pressure, but because a new standard had been established. Airports engaged legal consultants to reassess the treatment of passengers at first-class security checkpoints and during gate management. Educational institutions began incorporating Jerome's story into social science curricula at universities. At 1:12:50, he was invited to speak not in the role of a judge, but as an example of dignity, silence, and systemic bias. Rachel chose not to return to flying. She didn't pursue legal action or defend herself online. Instead, she accepted a position at a local community center, assisting young people in preparing for job interviews, travel, and public interactions. She candidly discussed her past mistakes and the blind spots she once held with pride, not portraying herself as a hero, but as someone who had experienced a significant fall, learning the true cost of certainty devoid of compassion during a day in a small classroom. A teenage boy raised his hand and inquired, "Why didn't he shout at you?" Rachel hesitated, her voice trembling, then replied gently, "Because he understood something I hadn't yet grasped." The boy pressed, "What's that?" She responded, "Silence doesn't equate to weakness. Sometimes it signifies that you've already triumphed." The room fell into a profound silence, the kind that lingers in your thoughts long after you've departed. Meanwhile, far from that classroom, Malcolm Hayes took a quiet stroll back to his courthouse, entered his chambers, greeted his clerk, and adjusted his robe. Settled into his rightful place without any objections or challenges. No one dared to question whether he had earned it, for this time the world had come to understand that some individuals do not need to prove their worth. They always belonged. They were simply waiting for everyone else to recognize it. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories on the way. The story of Judge Malcolm Hayes and flight attendant Sarah Mitchell offers a powerful lesson about the power of restraint, the consequences of prejudice, and the importance of personal responsibility. Hayes's dignified silence in the face of discrimination not only exposes Mitchell's wrongdoing, but also forces her to confront her own. The key lesson is that true power lies not in being loud or confrontational, but in self-control and the ability to let the truth speak for itself. Prejudice, even unconscious, can be deeply damaging, and only through honest reflection can people change. In today's American society, where issues of racism and social injustice are still present, this story reminds us of the importance of controlling personal prejudice. In the workplace, school, or public space, Making judgments based on appearance or assumptions can have serious consequences, both personally and organizationally. To do so, individuals need to practice listening, self-reflection, and fair action. Companies like Horizon Air need to invest in bias awareness training and establish clear accountability mechanisms. Individuals need to learn to pause, think before they act, and have the courage to admit when they are wrong. Hayes's Meaningful Silence and Mitchell's Journey to Redemption are calls to build a just society where dignity is respected and mistakes are opportunities for growth.